Liberty Baptist Church. So we had a celebration here, and George and I stood in front of the congregation. We had communion together. We had a buffet and fed everybody, and then we went outside and we talked about the importance of how important it is to ask forgiveness for something. And
for slavery.
For the sin of slavery in the family, and also on this land. And so we took communion, and the minister blessed the land. And then my husband and myself, our 4 children and 3 grandchildren, stood in front of the congregation and asked for forgiveness for the sin of slavery in our family line and on this land. And the minister, Reverend Johnson, talked to the congregation, and he said, you can't ask for forgiveness for something you did not do. And he said, but this family, as representatives of the white European man, has asked for forgiveness, and forgiveness has been granted. But he said, this isn't a one-way street. He said, we are descendants of the African slave. And he said, as such, we need to ask forgiveness of this family for all the hatred that's been harbored through the generations. And he said, if this is in your heart, I want you to do it. And if it isn't, don't do it. Because from this moment in time, there's no turning back. And he held his hand up like this. He had his church robes on. He said, come on, Liberty, let's go. And he walked over to George. And I'm straight to you. He walked over to George, and he took his hand, and you know how men take the elbow like that so they're this close, and he looked at George, and he was crying, and he said, would you forgive me and my ancestors for the wrong hatred that has been passed down through the generations? And George was crying, and then those 2 men hugged. They loved each other profoundly. So when George, every single solitary person that was here, they all individually went to George, to me, to our children, and to our grandchildren, shook our hand and asked our forgiveness. So we really bonded with the church. So I thought, well, that happened July the 19th in 2002. And when we learned about the freeing of the slaves from David Minge from here, I just thought, that was completion, because he freed the slaves and George asked for forgiveness. But then that book that's out in the hall I showed you, it's The First Emancipator. It's a fascinating book. You need to get it. It doesn't, it's only been published, I don't know how long, only about 2 years, I think. And what's his name? Robert Carter III of Shirley freed his slaves when just right after, probably about 1780, he freed all his slaves, and he had 500 slaves, and he had a huge plantation, and he grew, instead of growing tobacco, he grew wheat. So he had a bakery, a mill, and everything, so that they could, turn it into food that was edible. And but anyway, he freed all of his slaves back in the late 1700s. And then he gave them, they chose their own name, and he did it by giving them a deed of gift. He gifted themselves to themselves, and they all chose their own name, because see, we had not allowed them to have their own name. We gave them another name, so they got to choose all their names. And come to find out, that was George's 6th great grandfather, and I didn't know that. So what's in the heart of a man, when the Lord lays something on your heart generations ago and you don't know it, and then that same thought is passed down through the generations, because we didn't know any of that. If it wasn't for bed and breakfast people, I wouldn't know much of anything. so funny. So, did you get enough to eat?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
More than enough.